This guy was a whole other level and was the mastermind behind the October 7th massacre and assault on Israel. Tragically, we see still in the West Bank terrorism that strikes, and the mother who was on her way to deliver her fourth child in the hospital, shot and killed. I mean, these are horrific attacks that still take place just in our midst. The prospect that new leadership will take over, and we have to wait and see what exactly that leadership will look like, might be more flexible and open to a deal with Israel that could see some of the hostages released.
Yaakov, thank you for being with us.
Great to be with you, Michael.
Thank you, and so much to talk about. Qatar seemed to be at the center of everything this week. Break it down for us. Why is Qatar so important? It has over 300,000 citizens, but not many more, but such an outsized influence.
Well, because you're looking at population, but look at how deep their pockets are, right? This is about how much money they have. And the Qataris have for a long time been very sophisticated and savvy in the way they wield that influence through the money all over the world, whether it's influence on college campuses, sports teams, businesses, real estate, New York, London, Paris, you name it. But they've also made themselves very indispensable because they're one of maybe the few, if not the only country that can talk with all sides. So they can host talks for the Americans with the Taliban, and they can host talks for the Americans or for the Israelis with the Hamas leaders. So they say they're doing this as a service to the Western world. They're able to maintain these relations that then benefit countries that need to engage with terrorist groups that otherwise they wouldn't be able to engage with on a direct level. But at the same time, there's also the more negative side of these relations. The fact that Ismail Haniyeh, who the late Hamas leader, but as well as other Hamas leaders, Khalid Mashal, who are still living in Doha, in Qatar. The fact that the Qataris have funded Hamas upwards of billions of dollars over the last few years. And the Qataris would say, well, 1 second, Israel wanted us to give money. So it's a complicated relationship. And for the Americans, though, primarily, it's a relationship of strategic importance. And this is, I think, why the Qataris can get away with it. There's a couple of reasons why the Americans view them this way. One is, again, the money and the economic benefit. We saw Trump go there, sign upwards of $1 trillion in different economic deals. This is exactly what Trump wants, the $400 million 747 Boeing, new Air Force One jet. But it's also the fact that they are home to a very important air base for the Americans of CENTCOM, the Central Command in the Middle East. This is where America can use this base to project its power all throughout the region. And altogether, this makes the Americans, we heard this under Joe Biden, we see this now under Trump. Qatar, for America, is one of the most strategic non-NATO allies today.
And of course, it was in Qatar, while President Trump was in Qatar, that we heard that Idan Alexander was going to be released. What role did American diplomacy play there, and how does that affect the Israeli efforts to get the hostages out?
Well, Idan Alexander is interesting because I think everyone, every Israeli, definitely, and every Jew, and everyone who supports the Israeli state around the world is definitely moved by the fact that this IDF soldier who had been stationed along the border from the Golani Brigade on October 7th and was taken by Hamas has been released. By the way, there were fears in the weeks leading up to his release that he might have been killed. And for a number of days, neither the Israelis nor the Americans were able to ascertain exactly what was the status of Idan Alexander. So when he resurfaced, so-called, there was a great sigh of relief. The Americans have been talking directly with Hamas. We know that. We know that Adam Bowler, who's a senior advisor to the president and is responsible for something called the hostage envoy or hostage affairs, has been talking with Hamas. This isn't the first time. We know that Steve Witkoff, the Middle East special envoy, he might not be talking directly with the Hamas leaders, but he's very close with the Qataris. And Bowler, who works in conjunction with him, is talking directly with Hamas. Hamas's interest here, I think, in releasing Idan Alexander is very much seen as a gesture to Donald Trump on the eve of his visit here to the region. They want to get the Americans on their side because they want the Americans to put pressure on the Israelis to end this war. And they understand that Israel's vulnerability is really Washington. If Donald Trump slams his fist, pounds his fist on the table and says, it's time to end this war, it's going to be hard for Israel to keep going. And I think that Hamas did this in a way to push Israel into a corner to be able to get maybe a bigger deal with a bigger ceasefire that would at least end the offensive that we might now be on the brink of in the Gaza Strip.
And of course, another thing we saw with President Trump's visit to the region was the lifting of sanctions on Syria and a meeting with al-Jilani. What does that represent for Israel?
That was a huge, I think, historic moment. I mean, beyond the humor in it all, because Donald Trump, as always, with his unpredictability in the way he speaks, later said that al-Jilani, or Ahmed al-Shara, as he's now known, is an attractive man, right, and tough looking. But if I put that aside, the fact that America's president is meeting with a man who literally yesterday was an al-Qaeda operative, a jihadist. So now he wears a suit and not army fatigues. But this guy fought against American soldiers, American forces in Iraq not that long ago. HTS, Hayat Tahrir al-Shams, the radical Islamic organization, the rebel group that he led from Idlib in northwestern Syria, and which was supported by the Turks, and then barreled through Syria in just a matter of days a few months ago, was really an anti-Western al-Qaeda offshoot, right? These are not friends of the United States. They're definitely not friends of the State of Israel. But there's also an opportunity. And I think this is what we have to focus on for the moment. There's a threat, and we have to be very cautious, but there's an opportunity because Syria now is changing. And this is, by the way, to the credit of the State of Israel. I think this is what some people might be missing. Had Israel not weakened Hezbollah as it did in the war against Hezbollah in Lebanon, had not weakened Iran like it did after the April of last year and October of last year missile attacks against Israel, Israel bombed and destroyed their surface-to-air missile defense systems, the S-300s. We have changed the region as a country. Our military has changed the region. This is what allowed al-Shara to be able to barrel through and take over Syria. What pained me was that while the president of the United States is meeting with al-Shara, this is to Israel's credit. Israel should be getting the credit, right? Now, can this lead to a normalization process with Israel? Very possibly. But Israel has been burned too many times, and I think that that's what we also have to keep in mind. We pulled out of Gaza in 2005. Look at what happened. We pulled out of Lebanon in 2000. Look at what happened. We've pulled out of areas in the West Bank, and we look at what happened. So Israelis, when you say to them, you know, there's a now jihadist who became put on a suit, and now he talks like a Westerner, and everything's going to be okay, why would we believe that this time it will be different? So we have to be cautious, but I think we also have to give potential normalization or steps in that direction a chance.
And the regime, obviously, in Iran giving a watchful eye to all of this taking shape. What does the potential Iranian nuclear deal look like? What do those discussions look like right now, and how should we view this?
That's very concerning. I think when I look at the region and I see everything else that's happening, you know, Hamas in Gaza, Hezbollah now beaten back, but still there, still with capabilities, and they're going to wait for the day that they can maybe strike once again. Al-Jilani or al-Shara and what's happening in Syria, will they be good? Will they be bad? You know, we have to be wary and cautious and prepared on all of these different fronts. And tragically, we see still in the West Bank terrorism that strikes. And the mother who was on her way to deliver her fourth child in the hospital, shot and killed. I mean, these are horrific attacks that still take place just in our midst. But when we look at Iran, this is the potential for an existential threat for the State of Israel. And this is why it's a whole other league. It's a whole other level of what we potentially face. It does seem that the Americans right now are determined beyond any doubt to reach a deal with Iran. And in this determination, which is maybe motivated by the fact that the president wants to avoid a war, I think it's also motivated by this interest by President Trump, to make a deal, which is always the most important objective. Make a deal with Iran, make a deal with Hamas, make a deal with the Qataris, whether it's an economic deal, a business deal, a military deal, or a nuclear deal. He wants deals. And the Iranian deal that seems to be coming together, though, is not very different than the JCPOA, the 2015 nuclear accord that Barack Obama reached back then, which Israel was extremely opposed to and vehemently opposed to back in the day. This deal,
and Donald Trump was opposed to.
And Donald Trump pulled out of, correct, thank you, in 2018, right? Only now to go back into it. So what exactly will be the framework of this seems to be something that we should be concerned about, because what's coming out For example, we don't know for certain yet, but there have been reports that the Americans have said to them, listen, you have to stop advanced enrichment of uranium. So, you can do to 3.4%, which would be for so-called civilian program, which they don't really have and don't really need. But anything above that, 20% or even 60%, which they've reached, 90% is military. You don't need 20% for civilian nuclear programs, right? You don't. That's only on your path to a military program. That would stop. They would offshore it, send it out, and they would get, for the at least first few years, enriched uranium at the 3.4% level from the Russians. But then after a couple of years, they would be able to restart their enrichment. So they're holding on to all the centrifuges. This is Israel's greatest concern. Why do they need the centrifuges? And here we're going to have an issue. Now, the bigger problem to some extent is we all remember, Michael, how in 2015, Netanyahu was able to go to Washington and fight tooth and nail against this deal. And that's what got Donald Trump eventually a couple of years later to pull out of it. Can he fight Donald Trump the same way he was able to fight Barack Obama? I don't think so. So this puts Israel in a bit of a bind and in a very delicate situation right now where I think we have to skillfully and carefully work to influence the administration to make sure that the deal that is reached, which would avoid a war, which is always good, but it's not a deal that's just going to kick the can down the road by another 5, 10, 15 years.
And of course, another deal made by President Trump was with the Houthis, surprisingly agreeing not to bombard international shipping, U.S. ships. But Israel left out in the cold in that deal. What's the story?
Again, this is part of this concerning new wave that we have here among Israeli officials who I talk to, and they're watching what's happening with the administration. So there's the Iran, and there's the Don Alexander going and bypassing Israel and making a deal to get this one American Israeli hostage released. But also with the Houthis, right? He announces out of the blue that he's made a deal with the Houthis that they're going to stop attacking boats that are sailing through the Red Sea. So basically reopen the line of shipping, and America will stop its attacks against Yemen. But no mention of Israel. In other words, Israel, which is still attacked, and we had just a air siren in the middle of the night. I'm sure you in your home had to wake up.
Certainly did.
But we've been having them every few days now. This is something that just really raises the question, if you're making a deal with the Houthis, why are you leaving Israel on the sidelines? And I don't know that there's a really good answer, but the answer that I could potentially give is we have to recognize that relations with the Americans, it's not a zero-sum game, right? It's not that the Americans are totally with us or totally against us. There are American interests that are not always going to be our interests. And right now, for Donald Trump, making that deal with the Houthis is a greater interest. And if Israel still will get hammered once in a while with a missile here or there, most of which are intercepted by our missile defense systems like the Arrow, then so be it.
And the idea of targeting this week Mohammed Sinwar, the brother of
Yahya
Sinwar, taken out already by the IDF. What does that represent? What does he represent to Hamas? It's not just a tit-for-tat family affair.
These two brothers were really the leaders of Hamas over the last few years. Yahya was more front-facing, and he was a former prisoner in Israeli jails. He was released back in the Gilad Shalit deal in 2011, rose to power and fame, and probably one of the most ruthless, sadistic, and bloodthirsty Hamas leaders. None of them are good. None of them are Zionists, but this guy was a whole other level and was the mastermind behind the October 7th massacre and assault on Israel. His brother Muhammad, less known, had his strategic responsibilities. One of them, for example, the tunnel infrastructure throughout Gaza. He was one of the guys who was the mastermind, by the way, of the kidnapping of Gilad Shalit in 2006, which he then held on to for a number of years and made sure that his brother would be released in that swap 5 years later. Muhammad took up the reins of the leadership of Hamas after his brother Yahya was killed by Israeli soldiers just about a year ago or so. And since then, he has really dug in his heels when it came to the possibility of a hostage deal between Israel and Hamas. There's a lot of misinformation out there. And there's a lot of criticism that is legitimate also about the government here in Israel and if they have not been stalling. But no one can argue with the fact that we are up against a bloodthirsty, murderous terrorist organization, Hamas, led by Mohammed Sinwar. if he's now dead, and it does seem that that's the case after the bombing of the tunnel complex near a hospital in Khan Yunis, the prospect that new leadership will take over, and we have to wait and see what exactly that leadership will look like, might be more flexible and open to a deal with Israel that could see some of the hostages released. Too early to say that. It's premature, but that is, I think, the hope right now within the defense establishment of Israel. And for that reason, I think we're not yet seeing that full onslaught and assault that Israel had been threatening and saber-rattling, that we're going to go in and take over all of Gaza once again. The chariots, the Gideon, the name of this operation that they had given it, that's still moving slower than some people expected, because people thought it was going to start right away after Trump's visit. Trump's visit is now over for a couple of days. It seems that Israel is giving a chance to see what's going to be the effect, the ripple effect of Mohammed Sinwar's elimination.
Very fluid situation. I know you've studied extensively October 7th, 2023, and you have a new book coming out later this year called While Israel Slept. What do we expect to learn from that book?
I mean, the book is, I can't say it's the most positive, experience when you read it, because it's a very deeply disturbing story. And definitely the first part of the book, where we really go into detail of what happened in the 48 hours leading up to October 7th, the different signs that were there, the alarms that were blaring literally in different offices, and the pieces that were all, if they had been put together, small decisions could have prevented, and the whole world would be different. And that's what you just want to bang your head against the wall when you read this, because you say to yourself, if only they had. And unfortunately, they didn't. And we find ourselves where we are. But then it goes back in time, and it looks at, from the rise of Hamas back in the late 80s to what Hamas became on the eve of October 7th. How come Israel never decided to take on Hamas in a real way? We fought these rounds of violence. We had cycles, and every 2-3 years or so. But we had a genocidal, terrorist, murderous group on our border. And we somehow, the state of Israel, the Jewish people in Israel, said to ourselves, no, it's okay. We can live like this. We can arrange for Qatari money to go there. We can arrange for some workers to come in. We can fight and hit them a little, they'll hit us a little, and we'll kick the can down the road. And really, what I think has me most concerned is, how do we prevent this from happening again? Because I think you and I both know, Michael, that this could happen again. For one very simple reason. The Israeli people want peace at our core. We don't want to fight. So if we see an opportunity to stave off a conflict, not to have to fight, we will probably prefer that, even if it means we're kicking the can down the road. And for that reason, I think we really have to look at this region in a whole different lens today. How do we ensure that war will not happen again? Is unfortunately the only way to do that right now is to fight this war now. And that's painful and that's depressing. But it also gives me some optimism and hope, because I see what's happening right now. I see the change in the region, and I see that there are such amazing opportunities. We spoke about them: Syria, Iran's vulnerability, what's happening with Hezbollah, which has been degraded. The region has changed. Can we take advantage of what's changed now in this region to bring in a new era, which will prevent that war that might otherwise come in the future?
Important lessons we need to learn. While Israel Slept is available for pre-order right now. Yaakov Katz, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you for your analysis.
Thank you.